as Frankie explained, and as I look around, I see a number of familiar faces. As many of you know, I grew up here in Middlebury. Went to college. What I always say is that I went to college on the West Coast because, as 18-year-olds will, I was eager to get as far away as I possibly could from this place when I graduated from high school. And yet, I always do seem to be coming back to Vermont, and so it's a particular pleasure to be here in Middlebury, as Frankie said, a few days before I return to Doha. So I am an executive producer at Al Jazeera English, and when we get to questions, by the way, I'm going to speak relatively briefly because I always find these things are far more interesting if there's more time for questions and less time of me just going on. As an executive producer at Al Jazeera English, I am the person in charge of the newsroom during the shift. So TV is a little tricky because all television news operations use the same titles, but they mean different things at different networks. At Al Jazeera, the executive producer is the person in overall charge of the newsroom with final responsibility for both all program output and authority over news gathering. And that can mean things as small as the executive producer, you are in charge of making style choices. And what do I mean by style choices? Well, the largest refugee camp in the world is the Dadaab refugee camp on the Kenya-Somalian border. How do you spell Dadaab? Is that D-A-D-A-B or D-A-D-A-A-B? The answer is the latter, and that is an executive producer's decision. Other things that I've had to do recently as an executive producer is to explain to the Crown Prince of Jordan's Chief of Staff why no, I was not going to put the Crown Prince on the air because there was no reason to do so. I had a similar conversation regarding the former president of Pakistan with his agent. So we can talk about that later on, that sort of stuff later on if you're interested. But the ostensible topic tonight is 1 year after the Arab Spring. And I should add, by the way, I did not join Al Jazeera till the summer of 2011. So when the events of the Arab Spring were unfolding a year ago in the Middle East, I was actually here in Vermont teaching at UVM. So I was not on the ground for all of that. But of course I was following it all very closely. But so 1 year after the Arab Spring, the problem is with this, with these First Wednesdays things, you have to pick the titles for these things way in advance. So like I agreed to do this talk back in I think May, and the Humanities Council says, okay, well you need a title. It should be topical. So I thought, okay, well it'll be about 1 year after the Tahrir Square Revolution, so why don't we go with that? But what can we say now that we're 1 year on from the events that began in Tunisia and rolled through Egypt and then through much of the rest of the Arab world? It's odd to my mind. When I was doing media stuff, some local, some national, at the time all of this was unfolding, before the term Arab Spring had settled in, I tended to refer to it as something like the Arab world's winter of revolution. I find it odd that Arab Spring is the term that settled in because, of course, this is a reference to Prague Spring. And looking out, I'm thinking most of you are old enough to remember that the Prague Spring did not, in fact, end well for the Czechoslovaks. Now, one could argue, the way things have been going the last few months, that maybe that is more apt than perhaps last summer we all would have thought. Gregory Gauss, who I think some of you may know, he's the chairman of the political science department at UVM, and I should add, is one of, and this speaks well of UVM, Greg Gauss is one of the most eminent scholars in this country on Persian Gulf affairs. Greg has been sort of crusading in academic journals and such for the last 6 months to retire the term Arab Spring, and I think he likes calling it the Arab Winter of Discontent, which actually I think is probably better. I was a lot more hopeful about events around the region even 3 months ago than I am now. And that's unfortunate, but particularly when we look at what has been happening in Egypt in the last few months, I think it's very, very hard to look forward and be particularly optimistic about all of this. And when I say that my opinion of that really has changed recently, so in October, I needed to get away from Doha for a few days. So I flew down to Muscat, which is the capital of Oman. And the reason I went to Muscat, other than the fact that Muscat is an absolutely beautiful city, is that a friend of mine is the ambassador of a major European country which shall remain nameless in Doha. By the way, it is a sign, I find, that I'm getting older, that this guy, when he and I both lived in Cairo when we were in our 20s, he was like one of my drinking buddies who I'd like go out and get smashed with on a regular basis, and now he's an ambassador. So it was odd to see him in the big house with the big car with the flag on the front. You know, when he took me to the airport, he just like pulled the car up in a no loading zone and pulled it up onto the curb, and he said, no, I've got the flag and the diplomatic license plates. I can park wherever the hell I want. Walk into the terminal. So, but sitting down in Muscat with my friend, he said to me, you know, I'm really optimistic about all of this. I've been in the region as long as you have, and I think this is all going to turn out well. And admittedly, Oman is one of the places where things have been going better than others. But, you know, that was October. That was only 3 months ago, and things have gotten a lot worse since then. So what I'd like to do, sort of for the next 10 minutes or so, is take a very, very quick tour of sort of the major areas of the Arab Spring, and then tell you a little about what sort of challenges I think where we are now in the various countries pose to the United States as we begin this new year. And then I'll leave it at that and we can open the floor for questions. So, obviously the place to start is Tunisia, because Tunisia is where what we now call the Arab Spring began. As I'm sure you all know from extensive media coverage, a fruit seller in an obscure provincial part of Tunisia got so fed up with the grasping, petty bureaucracy of the Tunisian state that slightly over a year ago, I think it was actually in December of 2010, he killed him. He set himself on fire as a protest and died in hospital a few days later. And that was what touched off the demonstrations that drove President Ben Ali of Tunisia from power about 6 weeks later. Demonstrations which, you know, even people like me who keep track of the Middle East professionally didn't notice from over here in the United States until they'd been going on for about a month. I mean, most, you know, again, even people like me who professionally watch this stuff didn't notice the Tunisian revolution until it was about 2/3 of the way through. And the idea that Ben Ali was going to leave itself seemed hard to credit until about a day and a half or 2 days before he got on a plane and flew into exile in Saudi Arabia. You know, Idi Amin died recently. Presumably they can give him Idi Amin's house in Jeddah. You know, Idi Amin lived his entire exile in an opulent house provided to him by the Saudis just north of downtown Jeddah. So, and one of the things that drove Ben Ali from power, oddly enough, was the United States, but not because of anything we did. One of the things that touched all of this off, that really accelerated the movement in Tunisia, was WikiLeaks. And the revelation of cables, and it's worth remembering, none of the WikiLeaks cables that have been released are the highest classification level. There are 3 basic classification levels in the US system: confidential, secret, and top secret. Everything WikiLeaks has is secret or confidential. All the really good stuff, Bradley Manning, assuming that he's the one who leaked it all, never actually had access to. But even these kind of mid-level cables painted this picture like something out of the film Caligula of Ben Ali and the people around him. You know, like one of Ben Ali's sons had like a pet tiger that he used to set on the servants when they, for fun, when the servants displeased him. I mean, it's the sort of stories that to the extent we heard them in the Middle East at all in modern history, we tended to associate them with Saddam Hussein and his sons. And, you know, no one ever confused Ben Ali, you know, with being nice or a Democrat. But, you know, certainly even I sort of went, really? That's what Ben Ali's family's like? You know, and these were mostly accounts of like American diplomats who'd been invited to dinner at the palace and were kind of writing up what they'd seen when they came back to the embassy. And when all of this stuff came out, it just sort of accelerated what was happening. And suddenly Ben Ali was gone. And people like me looked at it and thought, well, that was interesting. Didn't see that coming. And then things kicked off in Egypt. You know, the day that Mubarak fell from power, I was on a panel, part of a panel discussion at UVM about what had just happened. You know, the panel, of course, had been arranged 4 or 5 days in advance. We didn't know that the timing was going to be literally that Mubarak was removed from the presidency like 7 hours before the panel discussion. And what I said that day at UVM was, this is very big. It's hard to, it's really hard to convey just how important this is. Tunisia, in some ways, is kind of like the Vermont of the Arab world, by which I mean that it's small, it's innocuous, people like it, but in terms of the broader politics of the region, no one would confuse it with being consequential. You know, because I think we would all admit that as much as we love Vermont, you know, when things happen in California, they tend to have more national resonance than when they happen in Vermont. But Egypt's a different story. Here's how big Egypt is. 1 in every 4 Arabs is an Egyptian. 1 in every 4. In linguistic terms, Arabic is a strange language. The written Arabic is the same from Oman to Morocco, but spoken Arabic, you know, what people actually talk to each other using, there are innumerable dialects, some of which are basically mutually unintelligible. The point of that being that because Egypt is such a large player within the Middle East, the Egyptian dialect of Arabic is the closest thing to there being a colloquial lingua franca in the Arab world. By the way, one of the weird things, when you ever like watch Arab League meetings, remember it's the Arab League, aren't they all Arabs? Don't they all speak Arabic? The camera pans around the table and there is invariably at least one leader who's got headphones on, listening to a translation. That would be the Algerian. Who, if he's like most Algerian presidents, is probably more comfortable in French than he is in Arabic. So when the demonstrations broke out in Tahrir Square about 11 months ago, that was huge. And when Mubarak was forced from power by what I think it's fair to call a palace coup, that was even more huge. But whereas Tunisia, a year down the line, looks like being sort of the hopeful story of the Arab Spring. I mean, it's not perfect. There have been a lot of bumps along the way, but basically Tunisia seems to be moving toward a reasonably representative, reasonably democratic future. You know, it's a long road still to travel, but things seem to be fairly straightforward. Egypt, after initially looking fairly hopeful for the first few months, has just been regressing one step or several steps at a time, really since late summer. What we've seen with Egypt is that the military, which is by far the most powerful institution in Egypt and has been for 60, 70 years, the military is not willing to give up its perks and privileges, and more importantly, is not willing to be placed in a position where any potential civilian ruler could affect those perks and privileges. On paper, Egypt, like the United States, has civilian control of the military, but it's worth noting that since the king of Egypt was overthrown in 1952, every single Egyptian president has been a military officer. You know, there was General Naguib, who was the figurehead when they first overthrew the king, Nasser, who was the actual coup plotter, who emerged from Naguib's shadow about 2 years later. Nasser's vice president Sadat was another one of the group of officers who overthrew the king. And Mubarak was the commander of the Egyptian Air Force. And while Mubarak never publicly appeared in a military uniform as president, and I think technically speaking he resigned his commission in the Air Force. There was like a 1-week gap between Sadat's assassination and Mubarak's formal installation as president, and I think he resigned his Air Force commission there during that period. Everyone within the military knew that it wasn't really President Mubarak they were dealing with, it was Air Marshal Mubarak, and that he was from their world and that they could trust him. They're not willing to let a civilian have that sort of power over them. it's also been very, very worrisome in Egypt that the tendency of the Egyptian regime, every time something goes wrong, has been to assume that foreigners, by which they generally mean us, the Israelis, and the Iranians, and in the minds of some really conspiratorially minded people, it might be us, the Israelis, and the Iranians all plotting together. Yeah, that we're plotting to somehow undermine the Egyptian state. Now, you know, I can see why the Iranians might want to do that, but we obviously, I think I probably don't need to tell you, have no interest in undermining the Egyptian state, and the Israelis have even less interest in doing that than we do. The worrisome thing that's come out of Egypt in terms of the elections, you know, the Egyptian, so what they're electing right now is an assembly that will rewrite the constitution, and then late this year there are supposed to be elections for a new parliament. The Constitutional Assembly elections were broken into three parts, and the third and final part was taking place, I think, yesterday and today. But the thing that has attracted the most attention here in the West has been the idea that the Muslim Brotherhood has done very, very well in these elections, and we can come back to that a little later. The thing that's worried me isn't so much the Muslim Brotherhood. I lived in Egypt for 7 years. I've dealt with the Muslim Brotherhood a lot. They don't scare me for a whole variety of reasons. But you have also had a party of what are known as Salafees, who are basically people who follow the interpretation of Islam as it exists in Saudi Arabia, and who are mostly funded by the Saudis. The Salafees have been taking about 20% of the vote, and you know, I don't think we should worry about an Egypt run by the Muslim Brotherhood. I think there's a lot to worry about in an Egypt in which the Salafees have a very significant hand in running the country. Now, on our quick tour, we'll now move on to Libya. There was a great article I read last night in the New York Review of Books. I think it's either in the current issue or the most recent issue before it, by Joshua Hammer, a great writer, spent many years with Newsweek. Hammer's article on how things stand in Libya is the best short summary that I've seen in the last few months. I was at Al Jazeera as the Libyan revolution sort of reached its conclusion. In some ways, the Libyan experience has been very hopeful, even perhaps inspiring. But I found it very telling that after Sirte, the last significant city held by Gaddafi's people, fell, NATO washed its hands of all involvement in Libya literally within about 4 days. Because I think what the folks at NATO headquarters in Brussels understand, but which has not been conveyed by me and fellow journalists as clearly as perhaps it should, is that Libya is still very, very unresolved, that the worst of the fighting may still be yet to come, that the people who make up Libya's nominal government, the thing that you get, like when you listen to Republican presidential debates, and the subject of Libya comes up, is candidates fixate on the fact that there are a number of significant people within the Libyan opposition, now the Libyan governing movement, who not just are Islamist, but who are markedly anti-American. The military commander of Tripoli is a guy named Belhaj, who spent 4 years at Guantanamo being tortured. And many Republicans look at this, and a number of the Republican presidential candidates have said, A, this is why you should keep Guantanamo open, and B, never release anybody, because C, they turn up back on the battlefield. I'm not sure I actually agree with that syllogism. But, so now he's the military commander of Tripoli. Now, Joshua Hammer's article, which I just read last night, actually makes a case that Belhaj himself has been sidelined because, and you're going to love this, many of the Libyan fighters don't trust him because since he spent 4 years in Guantanamo, he must be a CIA agent. So, But what it highlights is the degree to which everything is still still fractured in Libya. And in particular, the people who make up the sort of notional leadership of the National Transitional Council, many of them are people who held senior, in some cases ministerial positions under Gaddafi. Now, on one level, that shouldn't be surprising. Gaddafi took power in Libya in 1969. There is no one under the age of 70 in Libya who has had any job of any significance not under Gaddafi. There just isn't, because he was there for so long, 42 years. But you can see how people who were bleeding in the streets of Misrata or Sirte or Tripoli might be not particularly inclined to fall in line behind a bunch of guys in suits who've been living in exile in Qatar or Egypt or London for the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So I think Libya is still very much unresolved. I think NATO understood that, which is why NATO was so eager to get out of Libya, which brings us to Syria. Because one of the most interesting things that I see when I look at Syria is that the Syrian government really seems to believe its own propaganda. When it says, oh, you evil people in the West, don't come in, don't intervene here the way you did in Libya because we will make you pay. I think nobody looking at NATO's experience in Libya with clear eyes can believe for a minute that NATO is going to intervene in another Arab civil war anytime soon. Again, NATO got out of Libya really fast because they sensed that there was this little narrow window of opportunity that they could kind of scurry out through with it looking reasonably good. Remember, when we got into Libya back in March, what did our president say? And what did the British Prime Minister and the President of France, what did they all tell us? This is going to take a couple of weeks. Couple of weeks, we go in, we drop some bombs, it'll be easy. Now, and no American servicemen, in fact, I think no Western Allied servicemen at all died in the Libya operation, which is fantastic. On the other hand, none of us, starting with the US military, signed up for 7 months in Libya, and yet that was what we got. And because of the Libya experience, I would have argued that the chance of a Western intervention in Syria was always very, very small. Because of the way Libya unfolded, I think you would need a microscope to find those chances. Only 2 other countries to touch on really in detail. Bahrain, I think in many ways Bahrain is the truly tragic story of the Arab Spring. It is a small country that has had problems with political unrest off and on for about 15, 18 years. But things just sort of exploded in Bahrain and the government ruthlessly cracked down, and we in the Western world just looked the other way. And the United States in particular looked the other way because, as I'm sure some of you are aware, this tiny, tiny country, Bahrain is about 30 miles north-south and about 10 miles east-west, but it's only about the northern third of the main island that's actually populated. So it's got a population of about 1.5 million who mostly live in an area about the size of Addison or Chittenden County. But also within that area is the Mina Salman Naval Base, which is the home of the United States Fifth Fleet and the largest United States naval facility outside American soil. And there have been no attacks on the base. The base hasn't become an issue, but for that reason, to be blunt, we seem to have mostly decided that we're just going to look the other way. Yemen is less complicated basically because Yemen does seem to be going up in flames, but as someone who has been to Yemen 5 or 6 times, and I really love Yemen, it's one of my favorite countries, but even under normal circumstances, Yemen only barely has a functioning central government. So I think that what is happening in Yemen is tragic. The thing, but I don't think there's anything we can do about it. The big worry down in Washington is that Yemen is going to become what Afghanistan was in the years leading up to 9/11. And I look at that and I say, yeah, I think that's a serious possibility if it's not already happening. And I honestly can't think of a thing we can do about it. Yemenis have not managed to govern Yemen for hundreds and hundreds of years. I don't see why anybody thinks we're going to do a better job. Now, the last thing I'll leave you with are two limited successes. Kuwait and Oman, places you never really hear about. Why are Kuwait and Oman different? Well, in Oman, where my friend who I mentioned earlier is the ambassador of a big European country, as he pointed out, there was one demonstration in Oman, and the Sultan basically called in the demo leaders, and he said, what do you want? They handed him a list of demands, and he agreed to about 80% of them. And then he actually implemented what he said he was going to do. And for now, everybody's pretty much happy. My friend actually had a dinner at his residence with a bunch of the demonstration leaders and several leading Omani journalists. But Oman is a special situation. The Sultan of Oman has been in power since he overthrew his father with British help in 1970. The British had him overthrow his father because his father was basically living in the 17th century and was refusing to allow any development whatsoever. He wouldn't allow paved roads, he wouldn't allow education for boys or girls or anyone. Omanis who left the country to get an education were generally not allowed to return. His own son, the current Sultan, was sent off to be trained at Sandhurst, the British version of West Point, and upon his return, his father immediately placed him under house arrest for 4 years. So, this was the situation in which the British stepped in and basically said, this has got to stop, and they overthrew the father and placed the son on the throne. And the Sultan is genuinely revered by most Omanis. And I think there is a sort of general feeling that the Sultan wants what's best for the country. Now, how long that will continue, nobody knows. The Sultan is, pushing 70. He is unmarried, has no children. He is generally assumed to be gay, but you can't say that in the Arab world. What that means is there's no heir. Nobody, literally nobody knows who's going to take over when he dies. On the other hand, he opened an opera house in September, beautiful, sparkling opera house. They flew Placido Domingo in for the opening performance. I'm told it was very, very nice. Things in Oman seem to be going well. Kuwait's an odd case because Kuwait is the only place in the Persian Gulf that actually has something that we might recognize as a functioning parliament. And by the way, it has that mostly because of us. Kuwait gained its independence from Britain in 1961, and Britain set it up with a parliament when they left, and within about a year, the Kuwaiti royal family, the Al-Sabah, had dissolved the parliament. But throughout the 60s and 70s, the Kuwaiti parliament kept being reconstituted, and then it would get on the royal family's nerves, so they'd dissolve it again, and then it would be reconstituted. And this went back and forth, I think 5 times over a period of about 20 years. There were then, in the fall of 1989, as the Berlin Wall fell, there were also big pro-democracy demonstrations in Kuwait, which received hardly any coverage here in the West. Demonstrations which, proportionate to the country's population, were larger than anything that happened in Eastern Europe that fall. And the government ruthlessly suppressed them, attacked the protesters with fire hoses and police dogs. Police dogs, by the way, dogs are considered unclean in Islam, so sicking a dog on somebody is both physically nasty and it also has religious connotations to it. So the government shut everything down. Then Iraq invaded Kuwait. You know how that all ended. We came in, we kicked the Iraqis out of Kuwait. One of the things that the administration of the elder George Bush said to the Kuwaitis at the time was, now look, you got to bring the parliament back. You simply have to do that. This is a political issue in the United States. The Kuwaiti royal family had, while it was in exile, promised the opposition that in exchange for the opposition's support during exile, it would reconstitute the parliament. So as a result of the Iraqi invasion and the subsequent US liberation, Kuwait did in fact get its parliament back in 1991 and has kept it. Kuwaiti politics are pretty crazy and pretty rough and tumble. They've had, I think, 6 elections in the last 18 months because the emir the king is still able to appoint the cabinet, and Parliament can basically force a dissolution of the cabinet, but it doesn't have the ability. So the emir appoints cabinet ministers, and the Parliament has no say in that, but it can force a dissolution. And basically, the emir keeps appointing cabinet ministers, mostly from his own family, whom the Parliament doesn't like. They keep voting these guys out, and this circle goes on and on and on. But throughout all of this period over the last year, there hasn't been much trouble in Kuwait. And I think that's mostly because, as imperfect as the Kuwaiti parliament is, it serves as an important safety valve. And by the way, things have changed in Kuwait over the years. You know, the big tussle, you know, I would be the last person to say that the Emir of Kuwait was a far-sighted person with democratic values, but through the 90s, much of the argument was over whether women should get the right to vote. And it was the emir who wanted to give them the right to vote, and it was conservatives in the parliament who kept voting it down. Women do now have the right to vote in Kuwait, and in fact, in one of these recent elections, for the first time, so women got the right to vote, and several ran for office, didn't get elected, and then suddenly, last year, 4 women got elected, and oddly, in constituencies that numerically seem very heavily male. So, you know, there are 2 of them where 2 of them go veiled, 2 of them do not. All 4 of them have American educations. 3 of them, I think, have PhDs from American universities. So, you know, Kuwait is making progress. Now, my final thought, what does all this mean for the US? This is going to be the year, here in the United States, when we have to decide whether or not, or actually not whether or not, where we have to decide how we are going to live with Islamist governments. Again, you watch the Republican debates, and you see this argument made that, you know, well, we should have propped up Mubarak because now the Muslim Brotherhood's going to take over. You know, I would submit that we were not in a leaving aside the merits of whether we should have propped up Mubarak, we were simply not in a position to do so. And one of the reasons Egypt is as screwed up as it is at the moment is because Mubarak's argument for at least the last 25 years to us in the West has essentially been, you need me because if you don't get me, you get the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, but sooner or later he was going to go one way or another. And at that point, we were going to get the Muslim Brotherhood. So maybe it would be better if we learned to live with it. In particular, if we could get people in Congress not to end the careers of foreign service officers who go and make contact, you know, usually on orders from the State Department, with Islamist politicians. You know, and this is my final thought. You know, it's largely forgotten here in the U.S., but as we move into this year of and there are going to be a lot of elections around the Middle East over the coming year, 6 years ago, the Bush administration did something that the damage, the extent of the damage it did to America's reputation really is only now being understood. In late 2005, the Bush administration sort of twisted the arms of the Palestinians to get them to hold free, you know, reasonably free and fair elections in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. This was part of President Bush's initiative to push democracy in the Arab world near the beginning of his second term. Those elections were held in January of 2006, and as many of you will no doubt remember, in the Gaza Strip, Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, won. The United States turned around and immediately rejected the results of the election. This is largely forgotten in the United States, and even the Obama administration, if you ask them about it, will basically say, well, you know, Hamas is a terrorist organization and we don't deal with terrorist organizations. But the big takeaway that pretty much everybody in the Middle East got from that was that the U.S. is in no way serious about elections. You know, this last 6 months or so when I've been back in Qatar is the most extended period I've been back in the region. I mean, I'm in and out of the region all the time, but it's the first time I've been there for like that chunk of time in about 3 or 4 years. And I was really struck, particularly in our newsroom at Al Jazeera, where we have about 52 nationalities represented, that in every meeting where this sort of thing would be discussed, somebody would bring this up. and just say, well, but the U.S. isn't really in favor of elections, because if people it doesn't like win, they're just going to reject the results of the election. I actually heard a U.S. official recently say, when this was put to her, she said, well, the problem with that election in 2006 wasn't so much that Hamas won, it was that Hamas was allowed to enter at all. That we didn't set out parameters that said you can't run in the election unless you agree to support the existing peace agreements, unless you reject violence, unless you do this, unless you do that. And I said, well, yeah, but how legitimate is the election going to look if the overall perception is that the U.S. picked what foreign political parties got to run in it? And remember, that's an Obama administration official I had that conversation with. So I think that it is not widely understood here in the U.S. just how much damage we did to ourselves 6 years ago with that Palestinian election, and the degree to which we are going to have to learn to live with governments that whose coloration we might not like, because that's sort of what democracy is about, and this is not something you're going to be able to put back in the bottle. And I've talked like 15 minutes longer than I planned, so I'll leave it there, and happy to answer any questions you all might have. Yes, sir, at the back. Oh, I did leave Iraq off my list, didn't I? I spent a lot of time in Iraq, mostly between 2003 and 2005. It is clear, I think, that when Prime Minister Maliki looks around the region, whatever he may see, it's not a democratic wave. I mean, he clearly wants to be able to run Iraq the way other people have run Iraq for generations, and the way people have run other Arab countries. And I think that it may well be painful and it may get very nasty in Iraq, but I think we just need to stay out of this. I could have given you this talk 5 years ago, and and there's a good chance you would have asked some similar question to that, and I would have said, well, I think that there is going to be a certain amount of violence in Iraq when we withdraw, whether that is in 2005 or 2008 or 2011 or 2020. It's going to happen. That we were, for better or worse, one of the things that was keeping a lot of the Iraqi factions apart, and they were just going to wait us out. And so I think that Maliki is trying to consolidate his power both among the various Shia political parties and by crushing Sunni political power. The Kurds have taken the view for a number of years that, broadly speaking, they'd like to be independent, but not so badly that they aren't willing to let things slide for now. But if the country tips back into civil war over the next year, the Kurds may well take a different view of that. So I think it's going to be a very difficult year in Iraq, and it's probably going to be hard for us as Americans to watch it. Frankie.
Neither one of these countries are technically part of the Arab Spring, but let's face it, you can't really talk about the Middle East unless you start talking about Saudi Arabia and Israel. Any comments, or is that a whole different cause?
Well, in the case of Saudi Arabia, the big question is what's going to happen when the current king dies. In particular, what sort of power struggle there will be for who gets to be king after him. I don't think any of us really sort of know the answer to that. I guess the only thing I would say on Saudi Arabia is that you can get books going back to the 1960s, all of which explain to you why the House of Saud is going to fall in the next couple of years. But you know what? It's 2012 and they're still there. And the House of Saud does enjoy a great deal of public support, more than we might think. And the other thing to bear in mind is that the people who are the primary opponents of the Saudi royal family are mostly people who believe that the Saudi royal family are far too liberal in the way that they run the country. So, you know, the Saudi royal family are not as bad a thing as one might want. Israeli politics is a whole different matter, both internally and as Israel relates to the rest of the Arab world. I guess what I would say is that much of what I said about the United States learning to live with governments it's not necessarily going to like, that's a lesson the Israeli government is going to need to learn too, because the fact is they don't really have much choice. And you can tell that there are a lot of people who are very, very alarmed in Israel. I can absolutely understand that. I think if I were an Israeli, I might be pretty alarmed too. But you know, supposedly what good leaders are supposed to do is manage change. You know, how successful anybody's going to be at that, we'll just have to wait and see. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to ask you, if you look at the news reel, and I don't know how much Egyptians or Syrians see that kind of newsreel of their own country when it's in an upheaval, but I can't understand people rushing in hundreds and hundreds of people into a situation where people are being killed and constantly killed. I mean, where you must be seeing it, and then the next day you get more people coming in the same, as if it would never end. And it seems to me, I don't know, I find it very hard to imagine. I mean, I know they are frantic in many senses. You wonder if people would ever get that frantic in this country, if our economic...
Well, I think people are frantic. She's saying that she's surprised at the way that that despite all of the killing, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you're particularly thinking of places like Syria, that people still keep going out even though they know they're going to be shot. I think in the case of Syria, where clearly the government is willing to do absolutely anything to stay in power, I think there may simply be a perception that people have passed the point of no return. I can't obviously speak directly to the mentality of people in that situation, but I can easily see making the calculation that if the demonstrations all stopped in Syria tonight, what would happen next is that the Syrian government would start exacting its revenge, which means that you know, if you are a Syrian protester, I mean, maybe it's better to be killed protesting than to sit at home and wait for them to come get you. Yes, ma'am, you had your hand up a moment ago.
My question is about Syria, which you gave very little time to, and you said we have this minute possibility of the U.S. going into Syria.
Well, I said it was minute to begin with. I think it's non-existent now.
But you've got Iran up here, you've got Israel around here. How much of the U.S. interest in Syria has more to do with Iran and Syria's support of Iran as its opposition to Israel? Well,
U.S. interest in Syria is largely a function of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. I think there's no question of that. You know, we worry about Syria because the Israelis worry about Syria, and the Israelis have lots of reasons to worry about Syria. You know, Iran has used Syria as a conduit to its own clients in Lebanon for decades. Syria was the only Arab country that stood with Iran during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. Yeah, our issues with Iran, however, have mostly come to fixate on Iran's nuclear program, and I don't think I think Iran has enough of its own internal problems that it may be giving some sort of help to the Syrian security forces, but frankly, I'm not sure the Syrian security forces need a lot of Iranian help to know how to go out and repress protests. You know, whereas I think our fixation on Iran is really focused on other things and is less concerned about Syria than how it impacts Israel and how it impacts our allies in the Gulf. Yes.
Is Al Jazeera now readily available in the States, and is there a reason why we should be watching or listening?
It is readily available online. You can only actually get Al Jazeera on Al Jazeera English. Actually, you can get Al Jazeera Arabic quite easily through Dish Network, I think. Al Jazeera English is only available on cable systems in parts of, if you live in the Burlington Telecom part of Burlington, not in the Comcast part of Burlington. In Columbus, Ohio, one other place I'm forgetting, and very recently we went on the air in New York City over the summer and in Chicago about 6 or 8 weeks ago. However, it's very easy to watch it online. If you just go to aljazeera.com, there's a big button like right there in the middle of the screen that says watch live, click here. Also, if you have an iPhone or an Android phone, there's a free app you can download that allows you both to watch the live stream on the phone, and if you're in a place where your phone connection is not so good, you can just do the audio because that takes a lot less bandwidth. As to why you should be watching it, you know, when I got back to Vermont shortly before Thanksgiving, I spent my first morning at home. I sort of flipped on the TV, and I think I went to MSNBC because I kind of like Morning Joe. And I wound up sitting in front of the TV for about 4 hours, flipping between the cable networks, you know, 2 of which I've worked for at various points in my career. And I was just, you know, look, I knew how parochial and how intensely focused on domestic politics the 3 cable networks are. Again, I worked for 2 of them. But I was just sort of stunned by the degree to which I knew the degree to which foreign news has basically been banished from American TV screens, but it was a bit of a odd reminder. I would say the best reason to watch Al Jazeera English is if you're really interested in foreign affairs. It is, you know, there are only 3 English language news organizations that still do serious international news: us, the BBC, and CNN International. And here's why you should watch us. CNN International has been decimated by decisions made in terms of what CNN will subscribe to, which video news services they will take, where they can deploy correspondents. Decisions that were made because they made a certain amount of sense for domestic CNN, but left international with almost no access to video. So what it is, a lot of it's like radio on TV, basically. The BBC is still one of the world's great news organizations, but again, BBC World is a, you know, it lives kind of at the sufferance of domestic BBC and has been subjected to tremendous budget cuts over the last few years. With the result that while they've got very good people, they just, you know, they don't have the ability to deploy. Al Jazeera has taken many of the best people away from the BBC and from Sky and from ITN, even some people from Fox. You know, money is not an issue at Al Jazeera. It's the first newsroom I've ever worked in where money basically isn't an issue. Where, I mean, obviously, and particularly as an executive producer, I have the authority to spend a lot of money. But you know, the first question is always, how should we cover the story, not how much can we afford to spend on covering the story. You know, it's worth noting that Al Jazeera sent a crew up here to Vermont in October to do follow-up stories on Hurricane Irene. That was something that I suggested. And I said, hey, you know, there have been these terrible floods, worst in a century. The cold weather is going to come in 6 weeks. Of course, we all know it didn't, but you know, we didn't know that. We didn't know that in early October. And, you know, and they're scrambling. And somebody could have said in the editorial meeting, you're just pitching that because you're from Vermont. But the people who make the long-term planning decisions said, oh, you know, that's actually kind of a cool idea. So they sent a crew up here from New York. They couldn't get a satellite truck from Channel 3 or Channel 5 because of just the timing didn't work out. So they had to hire a satellite truck in Boston and pay it to drive up. So right there, that's like hundreds of dollars an hour. My guess would be that the network, and this is only a guess, that they spent $20,000 on having that team up here for 2 days, mostly because of the cost of that satellite truck, out of which we did 3 live shots, one of which was an interview with Governor Shumlin, and 2 packages. That's not a lot of TV content for 20 grand. But everybody at the end of the day thought, that was pretty good. Yeah, we got a couple of pretty good stories out of that. Good job. Jazeera is the only English language media operation that has the ability today to deploy resources like that. I was looking through my work email last night. We had 2 crews plus a guest booker in Iowa last night. Al Jazeera English, and it's not just a Middle Eastern network. Al Jazeera English has 6 correspondents in Latin America. 6. There's no.
Follow on. Why don't you have a budget?
Sorry, why don't we?
Where is your funding coming from?
The Emir of Qatar owns it. Technically, Al Jazeera is a not-for-profit foundation. In practice, it is owned by the Emir of Qatar. Where does the Emir of Qatar's money come from? Qatar is a tiny, tiny country that was already sitting on huge amounts of oil when it discovered about 20 years ago that it was also sitting on the largest natural gas field on Earth, which is why Qatar is now, by most statistical measures, the richest country in the world. And why does the Emir of Qatar dump hundreds of millions of dollars into this? My own view, and it's only a guess, it's not like I hang out with the Emir. I think he wants you to know where his country is. 10 years ago, when something happened in Dubai, everybody said, Dubai, where's that? Today, everybody knows where Dubai is. Now, for better or for worse, but everybody knows where Dubai is. I was watching Jon Stewart last night, had a Dubai joke because a lot of the new Mission Impossible movie is shot in Dubai. He said, oh, well, so-and-so wants to go to Dubai to jump off that Mission Impossible building. 10 years ago, nobody knew where Dubai was. I think the Emir would like people to know where his country is, and that's why he funds, not just Al Jazeera. There is right now a top-level men's tennis tournament going on in Doha. There's a next month that'll be the women. There's a Doha Tribeca Film Festival. Qatar Airways was created out of nothing like 10 years ago. Now flies all over the world, flies to 4 cities in the US, has daily flights to Buenos Aires. I cannot imagine that there is actually much demand for flights between Doha and Buenos Aires. My guess is that the Emir just likes the fact that there's that big plane with the 10-meter high letters that say Qatar on the fuselage, sitting on the ground in Buenos Aires for a few hours a day. World Cup in 2022. They're bidding for the 2020 Olympics. I doubt they're going to get them, but that's mainly because, as a general rule, nobody gets the Olympics on their first shot.
How big is
Qatar
Qatar?
is, well, I mean, it's mostly empty space. I mean, the city of Qatar has about 1.7 million people, but of the people who live in Qatar, 85% are foreigners. People like, that ranges from people like me to like Bangladeshis sweeping the streets. And you very, very rarely see Qataris. Like at Al Jazeera English, the sort of administrative level of people, when I have to go over to the finance department because of something, I deal with Qataris over there, but I think there's only one in the newsroom. But most Gulf countries, to one extent or other, are like that. Yes.
To stay with that subject, what is its reputation in the Middle East now? Do people in Syria tune into Al Jazeera to see what's really happening?
Well, I think you have to start by making a distinction between Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera Arabic. Al Jazeera Arabic remains, is in a highly competitive situation. It is the best known of a number of Arabic language news networks. Their main competitor is a network called Al Arabiya, which is mainly owned by Saudis, but it's run out of Dubai. There is a new network, which is a joint venture between the government of Abu Dhabi and Britain's Sky News, which is going to launch in the next few months, called Sky Arabia, and has been snarking up a lot of the best Arabic language journalism talent. Al Jazeera English, I think, has made a really good reputation for itself, not only around the region, but globally. We can certainly book pretty much anyone we want. it's not widely known or seen here in the U.S., but I think in much of Asia and Europe, it's regarded on an equal plane with the BBC, which in some sense it should be, because virtually everybody who works at Al Jazeera either worked at the BBC or at CNN or at Sky before we came to work there. The very first time I walked into the newsroom in July, the first person I saw was a guy I worked at Fox Baghdad with, who I did not know was at Al Jazeera. The second person I saw was someone I worked at CNN Kuwait with, and I hadn't known she was at Al Jazeera. And just up and down the line at almost every job, like most businesses, it's a small business, and it's full of people that I've encountered professionally at different times in my career. And they come to Al Jazeera because it's a good place to be. It's a place right now where you can do really good, high quality journalism without having to worry especially about money. The conventional wisdom is that the overall Al Jazeera group, which is not only the English channel and the Arabic channel, but it is a children's channel, a documentary channel, a kind of Arabic version of C-SPAN, and 7 channels of Al Jazeera Sports. The conventional wisdom, because the numbers are all privately held, the conventional wisdom is that the sports channels make all the money, and that the overall group maybe doesn't make money but doesn't lose an enormous amount of money. And the interesting thing is the sports channel, and this I can see I'm getting the hook here, so this will be my last comment. The sports channel has decided that it wants to be a gigantic player in Europe. And so from next year, from 2013, Al Jazeera Sports owns the domestic French television rights to French soccer, which is the first time that any foreign broadcaster has ever acquired the local TV rights to a top-level European soccer league. So there, as I understand it, there will be like one nationally broadcast free to over-the-air game, and the playoffs will also be broadcast by a French station. But everything else, you got to get an Al Jazeera subscription if you're French, or you can't see French soccer.
Well, with that, I could say that we will post on the library's website all the job postings so that you can go over and work.
We are hiring. Thank you very much, everyone.